As a result of Pearl Harbor, the United States now prepares to enter into what later will be called World War II. See the numbers of dead there? The casualty list is stunning. And then if you compare that to the rest of the world, you'll see the untold of horror that was gripping the entire globe. For the United States to be successful in fighting what will now become a two-front war, it needs contributions from every aspect, every part of American society. Men, women, black, white, Asian, Latino, Native Americans, and the list goes on and on. And fortunately, she would get just that. From a military standpoint, African Americans, of course, for so long, segregated from our armed forces, not allowed oftentimes to take part in some of the most militarily taxing jobs. Now, all of a sudden, serving as fighter pilots, tank drivers, the Red Ball Express, etc., become key components of the United States military machine. Native Americans, particularly the Navajo code talkers, in the Pacific. Again, this goes on. We're going to take a look at how the United States gears up for war, both from a domestic standpoint and finally a military entry into the war. Again, the attack on Pearl Harbor is what pulls the United States out of its isolationist mindset, and now fully 90-some% of all Americans back our inclusion into the war. Shortly after Pearl Harbor, the Nazis do Roosevelt a favor, and they declare war on the United States, now easing the way for us to in turn declare war on Germany. So by mid-December 1941, we are fully engaged in World War II. A date, December 7th, 1941, which of course, as we've heard many times, Roosevelt tells a stunned Congress that will live in infamy. But it's going to live in infamy for more than just the attack on Pearl Harbor. The United States is going to succumb to xenophobia. This, particularly the war against Japan, becomes a racial war on both sides, I may add. Both the Japanese and the Americans consider themselves superior. They consider themselves to be the ultimate answer to all problems. And as such, the unspeakable atrocities that are committed on both sides can be drawn right back to that racist bent. Within the United States, it's going to manifest itself with the internment of the Japanese Americans. Roosevelt will issue Executive Order 9066. That order is going to relocate, if you will, over 180-some thousand Japanese Americans, many of them born and raised here. They will lose their homes, their jobs. In many cases, if they have businesses, they will lose them, never to regain them. They will be uprooted from their homes and placed in internment camps scattered throughout the Western United States for the most part.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific.
This action would be taken all the way to the United States Supreme Court. But the court ruled in a decision called Korematsu versus the United States that the president was completely within his executive powers to issue such an edict. It wouldn't be until the 1990s that the United States would admit its wrongdoing, and it would then try to make some financial remuneration to the surviving Japanese of that internment camps, and pay some guilt money, if you will, for what transpired. One of the ironies is of World War II that the top decorated regiment in all of the United States military would be composed of entirely Japanese American citizens who would fight in Italy and in Germany. Now, not only did we have to mobilize against internal problems, but we had to mobilize in order to win the battle of production. We were going to become, as Roosevelt had said, the arsenal of democracy. Not only will we have to supply ourselves in fighting a two-front war in the Pacific and over in Europe, but we'd also have to supply our allies, England, the Soviet Union, and others. So this battle of production meant that there would be hardships felt by the American people. The phrase that best described it was, use it up, wear it out, make do, or do without. A lot of things were put on a basis where you needed certain raffle tickets in order to procure them. You were only allowed so much meat per week. You were only allowed a gallon of gas a week. You could only drive on certain days depending on your license plate number. Clothing, particularly like women's stockings, for example, silk was being put into making parachutes. So women would make it do by having spray paint put on their legs, appear to be stockings, and then with an eyeliner pencil, draw a line up the back of their calves, imitating that which would normally appear if you had silk stockings. And the list goes on and on. Candy was at a premium, particularly chocolate, because of the chocolate factories being used to produce bombs.
President Roosevelt knows that propaganda alone will not achieve victory. The country needs warplanes and ships. In 1942, a national war production drive is launched. The military's tremendous need for manpower and war materials pulled the U.S. out of her economic doldrums. Instantly, the Great Depression's lingering unemployment is erased. Millions of Americans leave their non-essential jobs and flock to war plants. The clatter of hammers and the clash of gears envelop the country. people from all professions and backgrounds turned their efforts to the consuming task of winning the war. Every sector of the American economy needs to work overtime. A mandatory 48-hour work week is put in place. Automobile plants are converted to make aircraft. By 1943, war production is in full swing. To combat significant losses at Pearl Harbor, shipyards run 24 hours a day. Liberty ships are mass-produced at a rate of 1 every 6 weeks. From 1942 until the end of the war, American shipyards will build over 75,000 ships. This astounding effort makes the United States the world's leading shipbuilder. Now there are more jobs than workers. Teenagers, the elderly, and even convicts are handed war-related jobs, but still more labor is needed.
And that labor, of course, was going to be women. Every aspect of American life is going to be impacted, from the rationing of meat, gasoline, and other goods, to the fact that no new cars would be built during the entire war. Housing was at a premium. The only new housing that was built was used to house the factory workers. For example, the shipyard workers at the Camden shipyards and in the Naval Yard in Philadelphia were housed at a number of places, one of which was Audubon Park, which is a small little development off the Black Horse Pike next to Audubon and the Black Horse Pike Shopping Center. Those white houses were used to hire or used to house naval personnel. And when you worked at the Navy Yard, you worked in shifts. And the yards were open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So 2 families would live in one house. And one family, while they're working their 12-hour shift, the other family would sleep, and then vice versa. And this was going on all over the country. But one of the heroes was a work of fiction, and that was Rosie the Riveter. Rosie would be made famous in the number of posters and pictures that were drawn of her. Was there really a Rosie? Not in the beginning. But eventually, they would find some of these people named Rosie, and they became media stars, if you will.
Rosie the Riveter is the female icon of World War II. She is the home front equivalent of G.I. Joe.
Now, in order to mobilize, the United States government is going to make great use of propaganda. Propaganda in many forms and in many fashions, whether it be the posters that you see now that were plastered all over the country in order, again, to get public opinion totally behind the war. Remember, everybody in some way, shape, or form was impacted by this war, sacrificed for this war, whether or not they carried a gun or simply stayed at home. Everybody was in it to win it, if you will.
I got soul, but I'm not a soldier. 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 With all these things that I've done, all these things that I've done, if you can hold on, if you can hold on.
Propaganda went beyond just posters. Norman Rockwell was the famous artist for the Saturday Evening Post. And anytime his pictures appeared on the cover, they always had to print up extra magazines because of the impact of his posters. Other posters, not so subtle. And then this is the Academy, the one and only Donald Duck.
In the Führer says, wie ist the master race? The Heil, Heil, right in the Führer's face. Not to love the Führer is a great disgrace. So the Heil, Heil, right in the Führer's face. When Herr Goebbels says, we own the world in space. The Heil, Heil.
Now, Bugs Bunny would later be drafted by the United States Marines. So this was quite often. So, propaganda mobilizing the home front and overseas, the war in Europe. By 1942, Germany was starting to slowly lose its control. The major opponent was the Soviet Union, its old ally. And when the United States entered the war, the remaining allies, United States, Great Britain, promised the Soviet Union they would open a second front, an attack in the West to divert some of the strength of Germany away from fighting the Russians. If you take a look at what Hitler called Operation Barbarossa, there in the red is all the area controlled by Germany. She attacked her ally, the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had helped dismember Poland with Germany and was close to Moscow, got within 35 miles. But eventually we open up that second front down here in North Africa, Operation Torch, and from there proceed into Europe. In the Soviet Union, the turning point of the war was about to take place in a city called Stalingrad.
While the U.S. and Britain, the Western Allies, were fighting in North Africa, the Soviet Red Army refused to surrender the city of Stalingrad in the face of an overwhelming German onslaught. In November 1942, the Soviets launched a heroic counterattack. The violent struggle lasted for 2 months. As the bitter winter set in, the German army faced frostbite, lice, starvation, and defeat. The epic Battle of Stalingrad devastated the city and left over 1 million Russians dead. But now, the victorious Soviet army began a steady march westward towards Germany. By the summer of 1943, Allied warplanes were bombing German cities day and night, slowly reducing them to rubble. Most attacks were aimed at military and industrial targets, like bridges, supply depots, and factories. But increasingly, Allied air forces targeted civilian centers for so-called terror bombing, designed to demoralize the German public. In one raid on the city of Dresden, the Allies dropped tons of incendiary bombs, creating a firestorm that killed more than 100,000. Before the war's end, over 650,000 innocent Germans perished from Allied bombing.
Now, the turning point in the Pacific was the Battle of...
While the U.S.
Now, Midway, the most incredible feeling of combat you will ever experience in a motion picture theater.
Battle of Midway involved the outgunned and outmanned United States Navy tricking the Japanese, finding out what their codes were, knowing where they were going to come, and then ambushing the Japanese fleet and sinking almost a half dozen of their aircraft carriers that the Japanese, did not have the industrial capacity to replace. And that was the turning point of the war in the Pacific, 1942. Now, you see the picture or the global view of the war in the Pacific. You see a series of islands all stretching and pointing to Japan. It would be these islands that the United States would carefully hop from one place to another. This became known as island hopping. It would be in 2 different areas, Northern Pacific and then the Southern Pacific, keeping the Japanese off balance and constantly getting closer and closer to the homeland of Japan so that we could bomb them. The Japanese, wished to have the East Asia co-prosperity sphere, an area that they would dominate, particularly for its natural resources, thus maintaining the dominance of the Isles of Japan. When we enter the war, Germany was going to be our first concern, as was determined by the Atlantic Charter between FDR and Churchill, but we became strong enough to conduct 2 full-fledged wars at the same time. These 2 battles, Coral Sea and Midway, finally gave us naval preeminence in the Pacific. There is the island hopping that we were talking about. The upper part of it would be conducted by Chester Nimitz, Admiral, United States Navy. The lower part of it would be led by General Douglas MacArthur of the United States Army, Commander-in-Chief of all ground forces in the Pacific. the contribution of the United States to this war was not only men, but obviously material. Thousands developed, chief among them the B-17.
Forward! 1, 2, 3, 4, hop, 2, 3, 4, hop, 2, 3, 4.
Thousands of Sherman tanks, inferior to those that the Germans possessed, but what they lacked in quality, they made up for in quantity. So, by 1943-44, the Russians were now pushing towards Germany. We had gone from North Africa to Sicily up into Italy, and then June 6th, 1944, D-Day, the second front is open. There you see Eisenhower, Dwight David Eisenhower, future President of the United States, addressing the 101st Airborne. D-Day, June 6th, the longest day. Catching the Germans completely by surprise, it gives us a foothold in Western Europe. But we were unprepared after the invasion. We got our foothold, but we're having difficulty in expanding it.
In the Allied plans for the invasion of Normandy, the capture of Caen was the natural next step after the initial landings on D-Day, the 6th of June, 1944. Caen, lying 10 miles from the coast, was supposed to be taken on this first day, but it proved to be 10 miles too far for the troops of the British Second Army and the 3rd Canadian Division, whose task it was to take the town. The British started out too late from the landing beaches in the afternoon, and even more crucially, they had to leave their tanks behind. The British armor was jammed up in the mass of vehicles that were crowding the invasion beaches. This, though, was only the start of the difficulties. When, at last, the tanks managed to move inland, they found that the Normandy countryside seemed to be conspiring against them. The bocage, or box country, close to Caen, certainly lived up to its name, with its checkerboard of small fields surrounded by hedgerows and narrow, twisting lanes. The Allied troops had been trained for fast, mobile warfare, but now found themselves embroiled in obstructive terrain, which slowed their progress to a crawl.
Those hedgerows served as natural fences, if you will, and they had been around for a couple of 100 years, so this isn't something you just take out with a pair of clippers. And for months, the Allies were stymied until they came up with a massive bombing campaign that flattened the hedges to nothing. The war eventually would give the Germans one last gasp. It would be the single biggest battle of the war, the Battle of the Bulge, which made famous the 101st Airborne, Bastogne, et cetera, et cetera. After that last gasp, it was on into Germany, and of course, the war would eventually end in May of 1945 in Germany. Over in the Pacific, I shall return, the catchphrase of General Douglas MacArthur, who was ordered to abandon the Philippines and come to Australia to organize a resistance to Japanese encroachments. MacArthur comes in for a lot of, and justified, criticism. He was an individual who was more concerned with looks sometimes than results. You see him here returning to the Philippines as he strides through the surf. That picture would be taken a dozen times till he was satisfied just how it looked.
We wait for a sign. Suribachi is ours.
Battle of Iwo Jima. The raising of the flag on top of Mount Suribachi.
Suribachi is ours. A toehold on the southern tip of the island. But ahead, the main strength of the Jap garrison was entrenched in steel and concrete.
5-mile square island would cost us 24,000 casualties. In the meantime, the big three that you see there, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, would hold wartime conferences to make sure that they were on the same page and were developing strategy that all of them agreed with. Casablanca, Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam were 4 of those meetings. Only 3 of them would be attended by all of them.
Among those stopping off at Malta prior to the Big Three conferences is W. Averill Harriman, U.S. Ambassador to the Soviets, and 5-star General George Marshall with British Field Marshal Wilson. The meeting at war-torn Malta is only preliminary to the final meeting with Marshal Stalin. The Mediterranean Conference of the Allied military leaders is held within the stately walls of Montgomery House. Here starts a series of talks that will profoundly influence the diplomatic and political future of the world. Field Marshal Alexander of the Mediterranean Theater and General Brayon Somerville and Admiral King attend. But the meeting really gets down to business at Yalta, former Crimean summer capital of the Tsars. Anthony Eden, Foreign Commissar Molotov, and Secretary Stettinius are on hand to greet England's Prime Minister. Hoping to solve intricate problems of war and peace, President Roosevelt reaches the Yalta meeting, accompanied by his daughter, Mrs. Anna Boddicker. These are Army Signal Corps pictures of an historic world meeting that will shape the destiny of future generations. The summer palace of Tsar Nicholas II is the setting for Russia's welcome. The conference is to seal Hitler's fate and establish lasting peace, and is attended by Presidential Advisor Harry Hopkins with Mr. Eden. The host arrives, Joseph Stalin, Chairman of the Council of People's Commissars of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Not since the Tehran Conference 14 months ago have the 3 top executives of Allied strategy and diplomacy met. Meantime, the results of that first meeting were bearing fruit on Germany's eastern and western borders.
Now, the 3 of them got together, and at this conference, Yalta, it would be the last one that Roosevelt would attend. There is some controversy that comes out of it. Most of the deals that were made in back rooms. And there are quite a few critics that believe that Roosevelt sold out to Stalin, and that he gave Stalin much, much more than Stalin deserved in terms of territory and other things. It turns out that Roosevelt was very sick, and that Roosevelt felt that he could handle Stalin. And his main concern at that time was not the development of borders in Europe, but to get the Soviet Union to declare war on Japan in order to limit the amount of casualties that the United States was going to have to endure in the war with Japan. It looked as if the war with Germany is fast coming to a close, but it did not look that way in the Pacific. And so Roosevelt strongly desired the Soviet Union's participation in the war in the Pacific. Now, what's going to happen after that is Roosevelt will fly home, and in April of 1945, he will die.
People die all the time, just like that. Why, you could wake up dead tomorrow.
Now, Roosevelt will address Congress, and for the only time in his 12 years as president, he alludes to his polio. As he sits down, the only time he ever sat down giving a speech, he asked Congress to forgive him for sitting, but they can imagine what it's like to stand carrying around 12 pounds of steel on each one of his legs. He then begins an impassioned speech in which he begs the United States not to repeat the mistakes at the end of World War I, but rather to learn from them and join a new organization that had been proposed the United Nations. From there, looking gaunt and tired, he travels to his home in Georgia, Warm Springs, there to try to recuperate. He is sitting for a portrait with a shawl around his shoulders and smiling, looking at a woman who had been his mistress for a good number of years, Lucy Mercer Rutherford. She had been snuck into the Warm Springs White House by Roosevelt's daughter. Mrs. Roosevelt, Eleanor, had no idea. Roosevelt then puts his hand to his head as he's sitting for the portrait, says, "I have a headache," and then will fall down dead, plunging the country and much of the free world into sadness because he would not be around to witness the final victory. May 8th, 1945, VE Day, victory in Europe. Germany will finally surrender. The democracies have triumphed. Scissors beats paper. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, a preview of coming attractions.
On Easter Sunday, following the pattern of invasion unleashed 100 times against Japanese bases, U.S. forces assaulted the island of Okinawa. First, the bombardment. Then, from the fleet standing offshore, the landing craft went in. The mighty pageant of assault rolled ahead again, this time less than 400 miles from Japan itself. This was the island that the Japanese simply could not afford to lose. For 4 months, they fought a desperate battle that cost them 90,000 lives. The island was safe in U.S. hands in July.
It is at the Battle of Okinawa that the Japanese introduce, in epic proportions, a new tactic, the kamikaze. Over 5,000 United States sailors will lose their lives as the fleet is constantly under attack. The Japanese, 90,000 of their 100,000 troops will die in combat rather than surrender. Over 100,000 Japanese civilians will die, many of them committing suicide by jumping off cliffs rather than surrender to the Americans. Much of that a result of propaganda. So, after the Battle of Okinawa, American military experts predicted that we would lose over 600,000 men in our invasion of Japan, scheduled for November of 1945. The rescue, if you will come FDR's secret, now made known to his vice president, Harry Truman, who had taken over the presidency, the Manhattan Project, the title given to the development of the atomic bomb. Here you see the first test deserts of New Mexico, outside of Los Alamos. Harry Truman, now attending the next post-war conference at Potsdam, informs Stalin of his decision to drop the bomb. Stalin did not act surprised at all, and Truman said, "I'll bet the son of a gun already knew about it," which he did. And that's going to lead to another controversy at the conclusion of the war. The bomb will be dropped by the Enola Gay, named after the pilot Colonel Tippett's mother. August 1955.
Below the boiling mushroom of flame and pulverized earth, first pictures of Japan's atom-bomb cities. Revealed here at ground level is a trail of devastation such as the world has never known. A single bomber, one bomb exploding 1,500 feet above the target, leaving no crater.
Now, the dropping of that bomb, most people say, is what caused the end of World War II in the Pacific. And that may not be accurate. There are a number of experts that believe the entry into the war by the Soviet Union is what caused Japan to finally surrender. We had dropped 2 bombs. We had threatened to drop more. The problem was we didn't have any more. And it would take us quite a long time to develop others at that time. The results of the dropping of the bomb are many. The repercussions will go far, far into the future besides just ending the war.
Falling for 43 seconds, the time and barometric triggers started the firing mechanism. A uranium bullet fired down a barrel into a uranium target. Together, they started a nuclear chain reaction. Solid matter began to come apart, releasing untold quantities of energy.
There was a white light in the window, a flash, white like magnesium.
The bomb delivered its destruction in stages. The flash came from a giant fireball 300 meters wide.
I was astonished. It was a startling light. Even if you had your back turned to it, you felt the shock go through, right to the center of your brain. At the same time, any area of skin that was exposed became very hot. Heat. Such burning heat.
Temperatures directly below the fireball were 4,000 degrees Celsius. The heat rays left shadows. Ladders, railings, even people left their outlines on stone and metal. Anyone in the open air was either vaporized or turned to carbon in an instant. At the same time, the flash sent out powerful infrared radiation and gamma rays. These could penetrate walls and attack the cells in human bodies.
Then I...
To this day, there are still people dying as a result of that attack. VJ Day, August 15th, 1945, the Japanese will officially surrender when the battleship USS Missouri docked in Tokyo Bay. Accepting that would be Douglas MacArthur and the other representatives of the Allied nations. World War II, for all intents and purposes, was over. And now the troops would return.
You will be assimilated.
But perhaps not that easy. Millions and millions of men and women in uniform would be coming home to what? In the meantime, retribution would be taken and a series of war crime trials would be held in Nuremberg, Germany, and later in the Pacific against Japanese war criminals.
Опыты по дублению человеческой кожи еще производились, и только победоносное наступление Красной Армии положило предел этому новому преступлению нацистов.
On May 9, 1945, German General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of Adolf Hitler's Thousand-Year Reich with an incredible request. He said, "The German people and the German armed forces are, for better or worse, delivered into the hands of the victors. In this hour, I can only express the hope that the victors will treat them with generosity." Even more incredibly, the victorious Allies answered the Nazis' dozen years of unspeakable murder with a compliance to that request. Beyond all reasonable expectation, the despised peoples against whom the Hitler assassins had so brutally sinned rose to a shining hour of reason, justice, and civilization. The Nuremberg trials daunted humanity with its first and only chance to bring to judgment a crime so enormous, so shocking, so widespread, that its sheer scope threatened to overwhelm any hope of prosecution. And the special challenge was to do it not with victor's vengeance, but with the fairness and justice so scorned by the defendants. Autumn 1945, Nuremberg, Germany. The faint echo of goose steps hangs in air still heavy with the stench of the dead in the rubble. The Klieglit flags and massed stormtrooper banners are gone. The hoarse roar of cheering voices is stilled. The sea of ramrod arms raised in salute has evaporated. And in the wind is the howl of the dead for revenge. In the ruins of Berlin, much of the top Nazi leadership, fearing the rough and ready justice of the approaching Russians, would take refuge in death. Suicide has been the escape of Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, and the icy SS sadist Heinrich Himmler. But a few already dead monsters at the top would not be enough to satisfy what would be the judgment of the century.
There was a strong sentiment at the end of the war when the Nazi depredations, the atrocities were revealed, to carry out drumhead justice, to put the Nazis up against the wall, shoot them.
But of course, that didn't happen. So, this generation dealt with the Depression, with World War II, and they're about to deal with an oncoming war. This is why many times they're called
1940 to 1949. World War II, the first war that killed more civilians than soldiers, dominated the decade. New technology raised the stakes, and for the first time, the world confronted the possibility of its own annihilation. France fell to Germany. By 1940, England, under the helm of Winston Churchill, stood alone against the Nazis.
We shall fight on, unconquerable, until the curse of Hitler is lifted.
Churchill met several times with Franklin Roosevelt to urge the U.S. to help the British war effort. Roosevelt's decision to enter the war was forced on him in 1941 when the Japanese unexpectedly attacked Pearl Harbor.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The whole country marshaled its resources behind the war effort. Women were recruited to work in factories, and Rosie the Riveter was born. The United States carried on a two-front war, fighting the Japanese in the Pacific and the other Axis powers in Europe. By the end of the 1944 D-Day invasion of France and the 1945 Battle of Iwo Jima, the tide had turned for the Allies. The war ended only after the United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The atomic age was underway. The end of the war was cause for celebration, and big band music provided the soundtrack. After the war, Americans returned to the national pastime, avidly following the rivalry between Joe DiMaggio and Ted Williams. Major League Baseball finally reflected America when African-American Jackie Robinson integrated the sport in 1947. The NATO Pact was signed, and the world was divided between the democracies of the West and the communist countries of the East.
That's a topic for another time. So, the price of all this, in terms of people, tens of millions, and atrocities too numerous to mention. The results of the war, the continuation that began in World War I of black migration to northern cities to avoid the discrimination that was taking place down there. Many black soldiers will come home, go back down south, and find that they still were being denied basic freedoms and rights. They found that while they couldn't eat in certain restaurants or go to movie theaters, that POWs, Italians and Germans were allowed to go, whereas they, who had fought for their country's freedom, could not. Women had been recruited into the workforce, and they would not go back. The most far-reaching set of laws passed during this era would be the GI Bill of Rights, granting the returning veterans education, housing, loans, etc. And this was going to democratize the face of America. People who never before could think about going to college or afford going to college, now all of a sudden were going to be included in that. However, once again, many black individuals were denied some of those rights given by the GI Bill. The civil rights movement would gain steam, particularly in the early 1950s and right on through the 1970s. We will become the preeminent military power in the world. And this becomes known as the American century because we will dominate it. And as an industrial power, there is none that is our rival. We will provide for quite a long time half, that's right, half of everything the world buys during this time period. As a result of both the Depression and the war, forevermore now will be linked the government and the economy. This will become a managed economy. Socialism, some people might call it. Those wartime alliances, in many cases, are going to become permanent, and they will be used during an era known as the Cold War. The rise of communism. A power vacuum existed in many places in the world, and when there is a vacuum, certain things rush in to fill that vacuum. And the fear of appeasement. We had given in to the Germans, which allowed them to miscalculate our resistance and continue warlike activities. So if we at any time appeared as we were giving in to the communists, well, that word appeasement would be trotted out. I end this with a list of films that if you haven't seen, you should, if you want to get a little bit of a deeper interest and more knowledge about World War II. Chief among them is the very first one, which I starred, PBS's The War by Ken Burns. It is an excellent, excellent look at all the aspects of the war from 4 different viewpoints. Again, I guarantee you will not be bored. The rest are Major Motion Pictures, Band of Brothers, which you can see on Amazon Prime and also HBO, as well as the Pacific. Saving Private Ryan is shown so many times too numerous to count. Judgment at Nuremberg, the story of those trials that convicted many of the Nazi war criminals. Schindler's List, talking about, of course, the Holocaust. Unbroken, true story of an American Olympic team member who would be a Japanese POW for a number of years and suffer unspeakable horrors. And then The Best Years of Our Lives, taking a look at the difficulties that returning veterans faced. Same type of difficulties that many of them are now facing as they come back from Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places overseas.